The easiest lie to believe is the one told under oath. The words drifted through the packed courtroom like a warning no one was ready to understand. Beneath the polished seal mounted high behind the judge's bench, Officer Daniel Brooks adjusted his uniform with practiced confidence, his expression calm, his posture steady, every movement carefully designed to project authority. 12 jurors watched him without blinking. Reporters sat poised with notebooks and cameras, waiting for another routine hearing that promised nothing more than another dispute between a decorated police officer and a quiet woman whose voice, they assumed, would soon disappear beneath official testimony. Morning sunlight filtered through the tall courthouse windows, stretching pale lines across the hardwood floor as the faint hum of the air conditioning mixed with the rustle of legal documents. Everything felt orderly, predictable, safe. Daniel preferred it that way because courtrooms had always been the one place where people believed the badge before the person wearing it. He cleared his throat, glanced toward the witness stand, then looked directly at the woman seated several feet away. Monica Carter wore a charcoal gray suit with a simple white blouse, her natural curls neatly pulled back, a leather folder resting untouched on her lap. She neither smiled nor frowned. She simply watched him with a level of patience that somehow unsettled anyone who met her eyes for more than a second. To most people in the room, she looked like an ordinary citizen pulled unwillingly into a legal battle. That assumption was exactly what Daniel expected everyone to believe. Rising confidently, he faced the judge and spoke in a measured voice polished by nearly 2 decades of courtroom appearances. He claimed Monica had interfered with an active investigation. He claimed she had fabricated statements. He claimed she had repeatedly attempted to mislead officers performing their duties. Each sentence sounded deliberate, supported by carefully chosen language that carried the weight of experience. Several jurors nodded subtly. A court clerk typed every word without hesitation. From the gallery, whispers floated quietly between strangers who had already begun deciding who deserved their trust. Monica never interrupted. She never objected. She never even reached for the folder resting in front of her. Instead, she folded her hands together and listened as though every accusation had already been anticipated long before anyone entered the courthouse that morning. Daniel noticed her silence and mistook it for surrender. Confidence settled deeper into his voice. If anyone had looked closely enough, they might have noticed the smallest detail that didn't belong. Monica wasn't watching the judge when Daniel spoke. She wasn't watching the jury either. Her attention never left Daniel himself, as though she were measuring something invisible with every sentence he delivered. Somewhere near the back of the courtroom, the heavy wooden doors opened just enough for several people in dark business attire to quietly step inside. No one paid them much attention. They took seats without speaking, blending naturally into the audience. Daniel never looked their way. Why would he? In his mind, today was supposed to end exactly as every other hearing had ended. His version of events would become the official record, another file placed neatly into the archives, another story accepted without question. What he could not possibly imagine was that every confident word leaving his mouth was quietly bringing months of hidden preparation to its final moment. The courtroom believed it was witnessing the beginning of an ordinary testimony. In reality, it was watching the final minutes before the truth introduced itself. 6 months earlier, the atmosphere inside the Federal Bureau of Investigation field office in Richmond had been very different from the polished calm of the courtroom. There were no reporters waiting outside, no spectators whispering from wooden benches, and no public testimony. There were only sealed files, quiet conversations, and a growing collection of unanswered complaints that all pointed toward the same name: Officer Daniel Brooks. The reports came from different neighborhoods, different families, and different witnesses who had never met one another, yet the details carried an unsettling pattern. Statements that changed after they were signed. Body camera footage that disappeared without explanation. Evidence logs that no longer matched official records. Cases that collapsed for reasons no one could clearly explain. One by one, the incidents looked ordinary. Together, they painted a picture that was impossible to ignore. Monica Carter sat across from a conference table covered with neatly organized folders, listening as the supervising agent reviewed each complaint with careful precision. No one in the room rushed to conclusions because assumptions were dangerous. Facts mattered. Evidence mattered. Patience mattered even more. The assignment required someone who could blend into any environment without drawing attention, someone disciplined enough to let the truth reveal itself instead of forcing it into the open. Monica accepted the case without hesitation. She understood that investigations built on emotion rarely survived inside a courtroom. Investigations built on documented truth could change entire institutions. Over the following months, she quietly stepped into Daniel Brooks's world without ever appearing to challenge it. She attended public hearings as an observer, reviewed archived court records, interviewed community members under unrelated pretexts, and studied dozens of routine police reports that most people would have dismissed after a quick glance. She noticed how Daniel always seemed completely comfortable when speaking under oath. His confidence never wavered, even when small details shifted from one statement to another. To everyone around him, those differences appeared insignificant. To Monica, they became pieces of a much larger puzzle. She kept detailed notes after every encounter, recording dates, times, locations, and conversations with meticulous care. Every document was cross-referenced. Every timeline was verified. Every conclusion required independent confirmation before it became part of the growing investigation. Weeks turned into months, and Daniel never once suspected that anyone was looking beyond the surface. He greeted courthouse employees by name, exchanged friendly conversations with attorneys, and walked through security checkpoints with the relaxed confidence of someone who believed his reputation answered every question before it was asked. Monica remained almost invisible, another professional moving quietly through hallways filled with lawyers, clerks, deputies, and visitors. More than once Daniel passed within only a few feet of her without giving her a second glance. That anonymity became her greatest advantage. The closer she moved to the truth, the less anyone seemed to notice she was there. Eventually, the investigation reached a point where observation alone was no longer enough. Federal supervisors approved the final phase, one designed to test whether Daniel would remain truthful when the pressure of public testimony arrived. They did not script his words. They did not encourage mistakes. They simply created the opportunity for honesty to reveal itself. On the morning of the hearing, Monica walked into the courthouse carrying the same leather folder she had carried for weeks. Inside rested months of carefully verified evidence that had never left federal custody. She understood something Daniel did not. The most revealing moment in any investigation often arrived when the subject believed nobody was still watching. Back inside the courtroom, the quiet confidence that surrounded Daniel Brooks continued to grow with every passing minute. He believed the hearing had already shifted in his favor because every answer he delivered sounded polished, measured, and familiar. Years of experience had taught him exactly how to present certainty without appearing rehearsed. He looked toward the jury often enough to establish trust, but never so often that it seemed calculated. When the prosecutor asked him to explain the sequence of events that had brought Monica Carter into the investigation, Daniel responded without the slightest pause. He described her as someone who had inserted herself into official matters without authorization. He claimed she had attempted to influence witnesses by asking unnecessary questions around the courthouse. He suggested that her presence had complicated an otherwise straightforward police inquiry. Every sentence flowed naturally into the next, creating a narrative that sounded complete to anyone hearing it for the first time. The courtroom remained silent except for the steady rhythm of the court reporter's keyboard and the occasional turning of legal documents. The judge listened carefully, showing little emotion. The jurors watched Daniel with expressions that revealed nothing, though a few quietly wrote notes beside the printed evidence already placed before them. Monica remained exactly where she had been since the hearing began. Her leather folder still rested unopened across her lap. She neither challenged Daniel nor whispered to her attorney. Instead, she observed every detail with remarkable patience, almost as though she had expected every sentence before it was spoken. A local reporter sitting near the front noticed her unusual composure and scribbled something into a notebook. It was difficult to understand how someone facing repeated accusations could appear so calm. Across the room, several courthouse employees exchanged brief glances before returning their attention to the witness stand. They had seen emotional confrontations before, raised voices before, dramatic objections before, but this felt different. The tension was almost invisible, building beneath the surface rather than exploding into open conflict. Daniel interpreted the silence as agreement. He believed people were accepting his version of events because no one interrupted him. Encouraged by that assumption, he became even more detailed. He referenced reports, conversations, and timelines with impressive confidence, carefully selecting facts that supported his conclusions while leaving out the details that complicated them. To an ordinary observer, the testimony sounded convincing. To Monica, it sounded familiar because she had spent months comparing every official statement Daniel had ever signed. Tiny differences appeared almost immediately. A date shifted by one day, a meeting described in a different order, a conversation that had supposedly taken place in an office where security records showed Daniel had never entered. They were small inconsistencies, almost impossible to recognize. Unless someone had studied every page for months, Monica recognized every one of them. She quietly placed one hand on the leather folder without opening it. Daniel noticed the movement and smiled faintly, assuming she had finally realized there was nothing left to say. He had no idea that inside the folder rested organized timelines, certified records, verified witness statements, and documentation prepared with the precision expected in a federal investigation. Near the rear of the courtroom, the unfamiliar visitors who had entered earlier remained completely silent. Their expressions never changed as Daniel continued speaking. They did not exchange comments or react to his testimony. They simply listened with careful attention, almost as though they were waiting for a particular sentence to arrive. Daniel never questioned why they were there. His attention remained fixed on convincing the people directly in front of him. He still believed the hearing was about proving Monica Carter wrong. He had not yet realized that every confident answer was quietly becoming another piece of the very investigation he had never seen coming. The prosecutor stepped back from the witness stand, and the room settled into a silence so complete that even the ticking clock above the courtroom doors seemed unusually loud. Daniel Brooks adjusted the sleeves of his uniform and allowed himself a quiet breath of satisfaction. From where he stood, everything appeared to be unfolding exactly as he had expected. The judge had listened without interruption. The jury had remained attentive. No dramatic objections had challenged his testimony. Across the aisle, Monica Carter continued to sit with remarkable composure, her hands resting lightly on the leather folder that had remained closed since the hearing began. To Daniel, her silence looked like defeat. To Monica, it was discipline. She had spent months preparing herself for this exact moment, reminding herself that investigations were not won by emotion but by patience. Every accusation Daniel delivered simply confirmed another detail she had already documented long before entering the courthouse that morning. She remembered reviewing countless pages of reports late into quiet evenings inside the Federal Bureau of Investigation office, comparing signatures, timestamps, dispatch records, courthouse visitor logs, and surveillance schedules until every inconsistency revealed its place inside a much larger pattern. That preparation allowed her to remain completely calm while others interpreted her silence as uncertainty. Imagine sitting in a courtroom while someone confidently tells a story about you that you already know cannot survive the weight of verified facts. Imagine hearing people around you whisper, wondering whether the officer in uniform must be telling the truth simply because he sounded convincing. Monica understood that truth often arrived quietly. It did not compete for attention. It simply waited until every piece fit together. A reporter glanced repeatedly between Daniel and Monica, sensing an unusual contrast that was difficult to explain. Daniel spoke with certainty, yet Monica carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had already seen the ending before the story reached its final page. Even the courtroom deputy, standing near the entrance, noticed that she never appeared anxious. She never searched the room for reassurance. She never avoided eye contact. Instead, she watched Daniel with calm focus, almost as though she were allowing him every opportunity to finish what he had chosen to begin. The jurors continued writing notes, unaware that several of Daniel's statements had already been compared against certified federal records months earlier. The atmosphere grew heavier, not because anyone raised a voice, but because expectations slowly replaced routine. Something about the hearing no longer felt ordinary. The unfamiliar visitors seated near the rear remained perfectly still, quietly observing every exchange without drawing attention to themselves. Daniel finally looked toward Monica again, offering a restrained smile that carried more confidence than caution. He believed she had run out of options. He believed the hearing had become another example of his credibility overcoming criticism. Monica simply returned his gaze for a brief moment before lowering her eyes to the leather folder resting on her lap. Her fingertips lightly touched the edge of the cover, not opening it yet, only reminding herself that every verified document inside had been organized for one purpose alone. The courtroom still believed it was listening to competing stories. Monica knew it was only moments away from seeing the difference between a carefully rehearsed narrative and carefully documented truth. The judge looked toward Monica Carter for the first time since Daniel Brooks had completed his testimony and asked whether she wished to respond. The invitation was calm, almost routine, yet the atmosphere inside the courtroom shifted in a way no one could quite explain. Monica rose slowly, smoothing the front of her jacket before lifting the leather folder from her chair. There was no sign of frustration on her face, no urgency in her movements, and no attempt to match the confidence Daniel had displayed throughout the morning. Instead, she carried herself with the quiet precision of someone following a plan that had been established long before anyone entered the courthouse. Daniel watched her with growing certainty, convinced she was finally preparing to defend herself against the accusations he had carefully constructed. He expected an emotional denial or a desperate explanation. Instead, Monica walked to the counsel table, rested the folder on its polished surface, and waited until every eye in the courtroom settled on her. She did not open it immediately. The silence stretched for several long seconds, allowing anticipation to replace assumption. Even the reporters stopped writing, sensing that something important was about to happen. Monica looked briefly toward the judge before calmly addressing the court. Her voice was steady, respectful, and remarkably clear. She thanked the court for its patience and acknowledged the seriousness of the proceeding. Then she said something that caused several people to glance at one another in confusion. She explained that she had no intention of responding to every allegation individually, because the purpose of her presence had never been to argue over personal accusations. Her purpose had been to observe whether the testimony presented under oath remained consistent with documented facts collected over many months. Daniel frowned slightly. It was the first visible change in his expression all morning. Monica continued without raising her voice. She explained that careful investigations depended on verified records rather than assumptions, on complete timelines rather than isolated statements, and on evidence that could withstand independent examination. The jurors stopped taking notes for a moment, listening more closely than before. The judge leaned forward almost imperceptibly. Daniel folded his arms, still believing she was speaking in general terms because she lacked anything concrete to present. He had no idea that every sentence she spoke had been chosen with deliberate care. Monica finally rested one hand on the folder and gently released the clasp, securing it closed. The soft sound echoed farther than anyone expected in the quiet courtroom. She lifted the cover only slightly, revealing organized documents separated by neatly labeled tabs without exposing their contents. Daniel recognized none of the labels from where he stood, but something about the orderly presentation unsettled him for reasons he could not explain. Monica did not remove a single page. She simply looked toward the judge again and stated that everything inside had been collected according to federal investigative procedures, independently verified, and preserved through documented chains of custody. Those unfamiliar visitors seated near the rear of the courtroom quietly exchanged brief glances for the first time since entering the building. Their expressions remained composed, but their attention sharpened. Daniel's confidence began to compete with curiosity. He searched Monica's face for some hint that she was bluffing, yet found only calm certainty. The courtroom had entered unfamiliar territory. No longer did it feel like a disagreement between an officer and a private citizen. Without revealing a single document, Monica had transformed the hearing into something far more significant, and for the very first time that morning Daniel Brooks found himself wondering whether he truly understood who had been sitting across from him all along. Monica Carter took a slow breath before opening the leather folder completely. The courtroom remained so quiet that the turning of a single page seemed louder than anyone expected. She carefully removed a slim credential wallet and placed it beside the organized file without saying a word. Several jurors leaned forward instinctively. Daniel Brooks watched the movement with growing uncertainty, trying to understand why someone who had remained silent for so long appeared completely unshaken. Monica looked toward the judge and spoke with the same calm professionalism that had defined every word she had uttered that morning. She explained that before discussing any of the documents before the court, she had an obligation to clarify the capacity in which she had been present throughout the proceeding. Slowly, she opened the credential wallet and turned it so the judge could see it clearly. The room seemed to freeze. The gold badge reflected the morning light as the official identification beside it confirmed her position as a special agent with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. No one spoke. Even the court reporter hesitated for a brief second before continuing to record the moment. Daniel's confident expression disappeared almost instantly. His eyes shifted from the badge to Monica and back again, as though hoping he had misunderstood what he was seeing. Monica calmly continued, explaining that she had not attended the hearing as an ordinary witness or private citizen. She had participated as the lead case agent overseeing a federal investigation that had been authorized months earlier after multiple documented complaints raised concerns requiring independent review. She emphasized that the investigation had never focused on assumptions or rumors. Every finding had been supported by verified records, documented timelines, and evidence collected according to established federal procedures. The judge remained composed, though the surprise on the faces of those seated throughout the courtroom was impossible to ignore. Reporters quickly reached for their notebooks, writing faster than they had at any other point during the hearing. Daniel opened his mouth as though preparing to respond, but no words came. For the first time that morning, certainty had abandoned him. Monica gently placed several sealed documents on the counsel table without opening them. She explained that their contents had already been submitted through the appropriate legal channels and would be presented according to the court's direction rather than through public speculation. Her discipline reinforced the seriousness of the moment. She was not there to embarrass anyone. She was there to ensure that established legal procedures were respected from beginning to end. As she finished speaking, the unfamiliar visitors seated near the back of the courtroom quietly rose from their seats. Their movements were calm, coordinated, and deliberate. They approached the front only after receiving a subtle acknowledgement from Monica. Each displayed official federal credentials as they reached the area near the counsel tables. A ripple of astonishment moved through the gallery. The spectators who had assumed they were ordinary observers suddenly realized they had been witnessing something far larger than a routine hearing. Daniel slowly looked around the courtroom, noticing for the first time that the room no longer felt under his control. The confidence that had carried him through his testimony had been replaced by an uncomfortable awareness that every statement he had made now existed within an entirely different context. Monica closed the credential wallet, rested one hand on the investigation file, and met Daniel's eyes with quiet composure. She did not celebrate. She did not accuse. She simply stood with the calm confidence of someone who had trusted the truth to arrive exactly when it was supposed to. For several long seconds, no one inside the courtroom seemed willing to speak. The silence carried a different weight now because every assumption that had shaped the morning had quietly dissolved. Officer Daniel Brooks remained standing at the witness stand, but the confidence that had once defined his posture had given way to visible uncertainty. His attention shifted repeatedly between Monica, Carter, the federal agent standing nearby, and the judge, as though searching for an explanation that would restore the certainty he had enjoyed only moments earlier. Monica remained composed. She neither celebrated the revelation nor allowed the atmosphere to become confrontational. Instead, she opened the investigation file and carefully removed the first section of documents. Every page had been organized chronologically, each supported by certified records, official timestamps, and independently verified sources. She explained that the investigation had never depended upon a single conversation or one isolated complaint. It had been built through months of consistent documentation, with every detail reviewed according to established federal standards before becoming part of the official case. The judge accepted the first packet for review while another copy was provided through the proper legal process. Monica continued in the same calm voice, explaining that several statements made during Daniel's testimony differed from previously documented records that had been preserved months before the hearing. She identified differences in reported timelines, official activity logs, and written accounts that had already been authenticated through multiple independent sources. Rather than making accusations, She simply directed the court's attention to the documented sequence of events, allowing the records to speak for themselves. The jurors followed each explanation with increasing concentration. Some compared their notes from Daniel's testimony with the newly presented timeline, while others carefully watched the judge's reaction. The courtroom reporter continued typing steadily, capturing every word as the hearing transformed from competing narratives into a careful examination of verified facts. Daniel finally requested permission to clarify portions of his earlier testimony. His voice remained respectful, but the certainty that had once filled every sentence was noticeably absent. Before responding, the judge reviewed several pages in silence, comparing dates and references contained within the federal file. Monica waited patiently without interruption. She understood that credibility did not come from speaking the loudest. It came from allowing documented evidence to withstand careful scrutiny. The federal agents standing quietly behind the counsel tables remained observers, making no attempt to influence the proceeding. Their presence alone reminded everyone that the investigation had reached this courtroom only after months of preparation and legal review. Members of the public gallery who had entered expecting an ordinary hearing now watched with complete attention, realizing they were witnessing the careful unfolding of a process built upon patience rather than drama. Daniel lowered his eyes toward the witness stand as the weight of the documented timeline became increasingly difficult to dismiss. Every statement was now measured against records created long before the hearing had begun. The assumptions that had once worked in his favor no longer carried the same authority when placed beside independently verified documentation. Monica closed the final section of the file and rested her hands calmly upon it once more. She did not need dramatic words or emotional arguments. The months of careful preparation had already accomplished what determination alone never could. One document after another had quietly shifted the balance inside the courtroom, reminding everyone present that confidence could shape a story for a little while, but only verifiable truth could withstand the careful light of justice. The courtroom no longer felt like the place Daniel Brooks had entered earlier that morning. The confidence that had once surrounded him had quietly disappeared, replaced by the unmistakable reality that every statement would now be measured against a carefully documented record rather than accepted at face value. The judge spent several minutes reviewing the certified materials before looking up and addressing both parties with calm deliberation. The court emphasized that credibility depended upon consistency, documentation, and transparency, principles that formed the foundation of every legal proceeding. Monica Carter acknowledged the court with a respectful nod before presenting one final section of the investigative file. Unlike the earlier documents, these pages focused not on individual events, but on the broader timeline assembled during the federal review. Dates aligned with verified activity logs. Public records corresponded with official filings. Statements collected months apart reflected the same sequence of facts without contradiction. The strength of the investigation did not come from one dramatic discovery. It came from hundreds of small details fitting together with remarkable precision. Members of the jury carefully followed the chronology as each document reinforced the one before it. What had once appeared to be isolated questions now formed a complete picture supported by independent verification. Daniel requested another opportunity to address the court. This time his tone carried none of the certainty that had defined his earlier testimony. He explained that some of the differences might have resulted from memory, administrative mistakes, or misunderstandings accumulated over years of service. The explanation was delivered respectfully, yet even he seemed to recognize that it no longer carried the confidence with which he had begun the hearing. The judge listened patiently before explaining that questions regarding intent would be evaluated through the proper legal process, but the documented inconsistencies themselves could not simply be ignored. Monica remained silent throughout the exchange, allowing the court to conduct its work without interruption. The federal agents standing nearby also remained professional and reserved, never attempting to influence the proceeding beyond their official responsibilities. Their restraint spoke volumes. This had never been about creating a dramatic confrontation. It had always been about allowing established institutions to function exactly as they were designed to function when supported by reliable evidence. After reviewing the submissions, The judge announced that the hearing would proceed under revised circumstances in light of the federal investigation and the newly presented documentation. Certain matters would be referred through the appropriate judicial and administrative channels for further review according to established legal procedures. Around the courtroom, quiet conversations immediately faded as everyone recognized the significance of that decision. Reporters continued writing rapidly, understanding that the story unfolding before them was no longer about competing personal accounts. It had become an example of how careful documentation could fundamentally change the direction of a legal proceeding. Daniel slowly lowered his gaze, reflecting on the path that had brought him to this moment. The authority he had relied upon throughout his career could not substitute for verified facts when every record was examined side by side. Across the room, Monica carefully gathered the remaining documents and returned them to the leather folder with the same deliberate precision she had shown from the very beginning. She displayed neither satisfaction nor resentment. She understood that justice was not measured by humiliation or celebration. It was measured by whether the truth could endure careful examination. As the judge concluded this stage of the hearing, the atmosphere inside the courtroom felt profoundly different from when the day had begun. Nothing had changed through raised voices or dramatic confrontation. Everything had changed because patience, preparation, and documented truth had quietly earned the confidence that assumptions never could. When the judge finally recessed the hearing, the courtroom remained unusually quiet. No one hurried toward the exits. No one seemed eager to break the silence that had settled over the room. The same people who had entered expecting a routine legal proceeding now left carrying a very different understanding of what they had witnessed. Reporters gathered their notes with unusual care, knowing the most important part of the story was not the unexpected revelation of Monica Carter's identity. It was the reminder that truth could remain invisible for months and still arrive with undeniable clarity when supported by patience and documented facts. The jurors quietly filed out, each carrying the responsibility of remembering that confidence and credibility were never the same thing. Daniel Brooks remained seated for several moments after the courtroom began to empty. His uniform had not changed. His title had not disappeared in an instant. Yet the certainty that had once surrounded both no longer carried the same meaning. Authority had opened the door for his voice to be heard, but authority alone had not been enough to withstand careful examination. Across the room, Monica closed the leather folder that had accompanied her through months of investigation. Every page inside had served its purpose without unnecessary drama. She thanked the court respectfully, acknowledged the judge, and exchanged brief professional conversations with the federal agents who had supported the investigation from the very beginning. There were no celebrations, no triumphant speeches. The outcome had never been about proving one person stronger than another. It had always been about allowing the legal process to function exactly as it was designed when everyone honored the same standard of accountability. Outside the courthouse, the afternoon sun reflected against the stone steps where people slowly dispersed into the busy streets. Television crews prepared their evening reports while courthouse employees returned to the ordinary rhythm of another workday. To most of the city, it would become another headline, another legal proceeding discussed for a few days before news stories replaced it. For the people who had sat inside that courtroom, however, the lesson would remain much longer. They had watched assumptions dissolve beneath documented truth. They had witnessed how quiet preparation could accomplish what loud arguments never could. Monica paused for a moment near the entrance before walking toward the waiting government vehicle. She looked back only once at the courthouse standing behind her, its columns glowing beneath the late afternoon light. She knew another investigation would eventually demand the same discipline, the same patience, and the same commitment to facts over appearances. That responsibility never truly ended. It simply moved from one case to the next. Daniel exited through a different doorway several minutes later, surrounded not by certainty, but by reflection. The path ahead would now follow established legal procedures rather than personal confidence. Every institution earned public trust only when it accepted honest examination, especially during uncomfortable moments. That principle protected every citizen equally, regardless of position, profession, or background. As the courthouse doors quietly closed behind the last visitors, The echoes of the day lingered in the empty hallway. People often believe that power belongs to the loudest voice in the room, but lasting justice has never depended upon volume. It depends upon integrity, patience, and the courage to let verified truth stand on its own. A badge may introduce authority, but character determines whether that authority deserves to endure. And on that unforgettable day, everyone inside that courtroom learned the same enduring lesson. Truth does not rush. Truth does not compete. Truth simply waits until the moment when no lie can stand beside it any longer.